Thank you very, very much. And thanks to the Italian Buddhist Union for this wonderful conference. I so wish I could be there in person next week, but this will have to do. And I also I'm just very grateful and honored to be on the same panel with three such enormously esteemed scholars, Hal and John and Alan, people from whom I have learned enormously over the decades. And also, it's a great pleasure to be sharing the panel with three wonderful friends with whom I've enjoyed really good times over the decades. And I really mean both of those things. The talk that I'm going to give builds very naturally and accidentally on the three talks that we've heard. And I could almost stop and just say what they said. But I figure it might be useful to offer these thoughts anyway, hoping that they tie together some of the issues that we've heard about so far. And you'll recognize echoes of each of the perspectives before. So I'm going to share my screen now and move into PowerPoint land. I apologize for that, but it's sometimes useful, especially for people for whom English isn't a first language, to have a little bit of text on the screen as well. So we're going to now do a screen share and hope that everything works. Let's see, we need stop screen, share screen, and we should be there. Is everything looking okay? I hope so. So my talk is called Cognitive Illusion and Immediate Experience, Perspectives from Buddhist Philosophy. And here's the plan for the talk. We're first going to talk about the role, a Buddhist perspective on where illusion fits into our lives in a broad framework. And then I want to talk about what I call the allure of immediacy, and a lore that we've heard a lot about in these three talks so far. So this will be a little bit familiar as well. Then I'm going to take us on a long arc through the Buddhist tradition, from Madhyamaka to Yogacara, to a synthesis of Madhyamaka and Yogacara through the great Buddhist scholar Shantarakshita. Then a little bit of Zen, trespassing on house territory. And finally, talking about what it is to know ourselves freed from the illusion of immediacy. So I'm going to begin by talking about this role of illusion in our lives. When we think about what Buddhism is first and foremost a solution to a problem. The problem is the ubiquity of suffering and samsara, and Buddhism is all about trying to solve that problem. And famously, there's a diagnosis of that problem where the immediate conditions of suffering are attraction and aversion, but where the root cause, the thing that gives rise to that attraction and aversion, to those pathologies, is a profound confusion about the nature of reality. And it's that confusion that leads us to the attraction and aversion that takes us into samsara. And since it's an illusion, we should pay attention to the classical Indian understanding of what illusion is. And that is something that appears in one way, but exists in another. That is, an illusion isn't something that's completely non-existent. It's something whose mode of existence and whose mode of appearance are discordant from one another. And we're going to be focusing on that a great deal in this talk. But the idea is that because this primal confusion, this illusion, lies at the root of suffering, the only way to end the problem of suffering is to extinguish the illusion. And what I want to talk about today is how that illusion manifests in the case of our own minds. And what I'm going to argue is this, that confusion manifests as a conviction that we have an immediate knowledge of our own minds, that we can be indubitably aware of the contents of our own minds. And the second aspect of that delusion, equally pernicious, is that it involves the superimposition of a subject-object duality on experience that is primordially non-dual. So that primal confusion can be thought of this way. It's taking that which is impermanent to be permanent, that which is a source of suffering to be a source of happiness, that which is only conventionally real to be ultimately real, that which is interdependent to be independent. And the important point for our purposes is that the thesis that our own experience is permeated with illusion applies to our experience of our own minds as well. That's what I want to emphasize here. Another way to put this, and we're going to go there in a moment, is that we could say that we're tempted, just overwhelmingly tempted, to believe that when we have perceptual experience, including introspective experience of our own minds, we think that we know that content immediately. The idea that to be in a cognitive state is to know that state. And the idea that our inner states present themselves to introspection, even trained introspection, just as they are. Another way to put this, as did the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, is this way, that impressions and thoughts appear to be simply given to us as the events they are, as instances of the types they instantiate. And this I take to be the deepest form of what Sellars identified as the myth of the given, the most difficult one to extirpate. We always forget that our knowledge of our own states is as mediated by language and conceptual apparatus as any other knowledge. So, when we attribute beliefs or knowledge, when we attribute cognitive states, when we attribute even sensations to ourselves or to others, we're always, I'm going to suggest, engaged in an active interpretation, a kind of self-hermeneutics, or a hermeneutic of the other. And we use language to model our inner life. We use external properties to model our inner life. And we're always modeling our inner life. We don't simply have it as it is. When we attribute sensory experiences to ourselves, for instance, like the experience of red or the experience of seeing blue, the model is external properties, and we think of there as being inner properties just like those external properties that somehow we are seeing immediately. But there's a second kind of cognitive illusion. This first cognitive illusion, as I've suggested, is thematized both in Buddhist philosophy and in Western philosophy. But the second kind of illusion I find not thematized so much in the West, though in some quarters it is, some, but not all, but very much thematized in Buddhist philosophy, and that is the superimposition of subject-object duality. And when we do that, we take the nature of our experience to be primordially structured as subject standing outside of the world, viewing an object. Now, we know that on the slightest bit of reflection, that's crazy, that we are biological organisms embedded in a physical world, and that all of our experience is the result of that embodied, embedded experience in the world. It's still, however, almost irresistible to have that kind of image of ourselves, as Wittgenstein put it, as like the eye to the visual field, that we stand outside of the world as pure subject, with everything else taken as object. And that reflexive taking of experience that way is a very profound kind of cognitive illusion, one that is extremely hard to shake. To overcome illusion, though, we first have to come to know that illusion better. You need to know your enemy in order to defeat your enemy. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to acquaint us with the nature of these illusions. That is to say, if we want to avoid a pointless trek through the desert for water, we'd better know that what we're seeing is a mirage and not an oasis. When we become aware of that fact, then we're able to redirect ourselves in the right direction. So in this essay, I'm going to explore what I take to be the very most profound illusions diagnosed in the Buddhist tradition, and the most difficult to overcome. And the primary one will be the illusion that we have immediate access and veridical access to our own experience, that we have a direct first-person access to our own minds that gives us our minds just as they are, that the duality between subject and object that structures our understanding is primordial. This is the illusion that we're subjects standing over and against the world, rather than interdependent beings in the world. That's the conviction that we might know the external world only through the mediation of our sensory and cognitive faculties, but that we know the world only in virtue of immediate access to the outputs of those faculties. So first, I'm going to really focus on that allure of immediacy, and then move into this kind of arc from Madhyamaka through Yogacara and into Zen. And my aim is going to be to show you that I think the Buddhist tradition gets all of these issues roughly right. That is, I'm not simply going to be characterizing what Buddhists say about this. I'm actually defending it. And I think that we can therefore learn a great deal about subjectivity through very careful attention to the multiple ways in which Buddhist philosophers have considered this issue. So I'm going to try to be shedding light on contemporary debates as well, by attention to Buddhist resources. And so let's start with the allure of immediacy. It's really easy to see both why people believe in the spontaneous way that we have immediate veridical access to our own perceptual and cognitive states. And the reason is that apperception is kind of perceptual in structure. And the Buddhist world encodes this by arguing that the internal sense, the manas vijnana, is a sense faculty just like external faculties. And so just as our external faculties present us with a world that just seems to us, even though we know it's not, to be just as it is, that we see it just as it is, it's tempting to think that we've got this apparent object distinct from our sensory apprehension of it, but an object that's presented by a completely veridical process. Because as I say, perception just feels like it presents the world to us as it is. I look at a red apple and I think, damn, I know exactly what that apple smells like, looks like, tastes like, and feels like, forgetting that all I have is the apple as it's mediated by the peculiar perceptual system that I have and by all of the conceptual resources through which I filter my perception. So in the same way, apperception or introspective awareness just feels like it presents our own cognitive, affective, and perceptual states to us, just as they are, independent of that apperceptive system and those conceptual categories. So just as external perception gives us the illusion that we're just detectors of the world as it is, inner perception can give us the illusion that we are just detectors of our inner world just as it is. So even when we remind ourselves, as I'm reminding you right now, of this extremely complex mediation of our perceptual encounter with external objects, we find ourselves constantly experiencing our own experience as though we've got the world just as it is. And then we sometimes say, okay, maybe we're not getting the world just as it is, but at least I'm getting my sensory experiences just as they are. The apple might not be red, but the redness I experience is exactly the redness that I think I experience. The sweetness that I introspect must be the sweetness just as it is, and so forth. So even if we give up for a moment, and it's hard to give it up for more than that, the notion of immediacy with regard to external perception, we often retreat to thinking that that's mediated, but my awareness of my own inner episodes is the immediate awareness that mediates my knowledge of the external world. And I think that in the sense of apperception, that sense of immediacy is even greater. It's really hard for us to be convinced that our inner experience could possibly be deceptive. We seem to think that if I think that I believe something, I must believe it. If I think that I'm feeling something, I must be feeling it. And that feeling and that believing grab my inner reality just as it is. And so part of the problem that arises is that the mediation of our introspective awareness by our introspective faculty becomes cognitively invisible to us. Just as when I'm seeing the world, my visual faculty is invisible and it just delivers a visible world to me. And I have to really think to understand what my own visual faculty, visual organ, and visual consciousness are contributing. I think I experience my introspective faculty as just giving me inner objects. And I have to think and remind myself that actually my inner sense faculty is also a fallible instrument and that I may be misusing that instrument, or that instrument might be intrinsically deceptive. And that's a hard thing to get one's mind around. As a consequence, we become seduced by this idea that even if our knowledge of some things is mediated, that mediation can't go all the way down. We get seduced by the idea that there's got to be a basic foundational level of experience to which we can have some kind of immediate access, and to which, when we know it absolutely veridically. In the theory of knowledge, that leads us to foundationalism. In the philosophy of mind, it leads us to sense datum theory. And I find that in a lot of Buddhist situations, a lot of Buddhist practitioners take it to be this idea of an infallibility, of an immediate kind of experience if I'm sitting on the cushion just right. So with all of that in play, I want to move to exercising that myth of the given that I've been characterizing, and to show that Buddhist philosophy offers us powerful ways of doing that. And I'm going to begin by talking about first-person knowledge through the lens of the Madhyamaka tradition. So we have there Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, two of my heroes in the Madhyamaka tradition, and these are the guys with whom we're going to start. If we think about what Nagarjuna's central insight or central contribution to Madhyamaka philosophy is, followed by Chandrakirti, it's that all phenomena we encounter are dependently originated, none exist intrinsically, and all are empty of an intrinsic nature. And that dependent origination and that emptiness of intrinsic nature amount to exactly the same thing. When Chandrakirti adumbrates this idea, he distinguishes three dimensions of dependent origination, and this is in his commentary on Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika called Clear Words. He talks about causal dependence, that is, every phenomenon depends upon causes and conditions and gives rise to further causes and conditions. Mereological dependence, that is, every phenomenon, every composite phenomenon depends upon the parts that it comprises, and every phenomenon is also dependent upon the wholes or the systems in which it figures. Parts depend on wholes, wholes depend on parts, and that reciprocal mereological dependence characterizes all of reality. And third, often overlooked but most important, is dependence on conceptual imputation. That is, things depend, in order to be represented as the kinds of things they are, on our conceptual resources, our affective resources, and as John Donne emphasized, our purposes in life. And this third one really means this. Everything that shows up for us in the world, the way we carve the world up, the way we experience the world, is dependent not just on how the world is, but on the conceptual resources as well as the perceptual resources through which we understand the world. And it's worth recognizing that when we think about this, there are a bunch of contemporary Madhyamikas we might point to as well. And so Paul Feyerabend, who's up there on the left, well, really an Austrian, but he spent much of his life in America. Willard Van Orman Quine, up on the right, Wilfrid Sellers, and Paul Churchland. Each of these folks, in different ways, has emphasized that our perceptual and our conceptual apparatus function, as we know the world, as measuring instruments, a word strikingly like the Sanskrit pramana, to which John directed our attention earlier this morning or this evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. These four philosophers, in very different ways, but in ways that intersect in very intriguing ways, emphasized that knowledge, sensory knowledge, perceptual knowledge, isn't the direct access to sensory properties or to objects around us, but rather is always the result of a complex cognitive and perceptual process mediated by our sense organs, our sense faculties, and our cognitive processes. And another way to put that, and this is a way that Paul Churchland puts this, but also Paul Feyerabend, also Sellers, is that the objects we experience, the world that we inhabit, the world in which we find ourselves embedded, is not a world that we simply find. It's a world that we construct and whose constituents we construct in our central nervous systems in response to sensory stimulation transduced by neural impulses. That is, somehow our bodies interact with other bodies in the world, and through various kinds of cognitive processes. I will defer the debates with Alan about how to think about the relationship between cognitive processes and the brain, leave that aside. But in any case, we would each agree that there's a substantial amount of mediation by the mind, however we understand the mind, in our relationship to the world. So our mind functions, as Dharmakirti emphasized, as an instrument through which we have access to the world. So Another aspect of the cognitive illusion that we're talking about, whether we look at it through Buddhist Madhyamikas or 20th and 21st century Western Madhyamikas, is that the illusion that pervades our sense perception is that what we experience is something external to us, that somehow we've got a world that exists as it is, independent of us, and that we simply happen to be perfect world detectors, and we wander through it detecting things just as they are. Another way to put this is that if you think about using a telescope, an example that Alan offered us a little while ago, to examine celestial objects, as indeed did Galileo, you can only interpret the output of that telescope, the things you see in the telescope correctly, if we actually know how it works. That's really obviously true about things like radio telescopes and infrared telescopes, but it's true of optical telescopes as well, as Paul Feyerabend emphasized. If you don't have a theory of optics, then when you aim your telescope at Jupiter and look at the moons, all you see are bits of light on a piece of glass. You need to believe and to know how the telescope works in order to understand those as moons orbiting a planet. So to put it crudely, if we don't know how the instrument that we're using, if we don't know how the instrument that we're using to mediate our access to the world works, if we don't understand it, we don't know whether we're looking through a great telescope or a kaleidoscope. And we don't know whether we're using a properly constructed radio telescope or just playing a fantasy video game. And the same point applies to us, to the inner as well. If we don't know how our senses are working, if we don't know that they work properly, or what kinds of distortions they engender, or how they construct the world, we don't know what kind of information they're delivering us. And so another aspect to cognitive illusion here is the illusion that our sense perception is something that is transparent and simply delivering us a world as a telescope does, and not as a kaleidoscope does. As a consequence, then, the sense that we know our own cognitive states directly and accurately through inner sense as well as outer sense has got to be a cognitive illusion as well. The sortals or the concepts that we use in order to introspect are just as opaque to us as our senses are, and give us just as a non-transparent access to our inner world as our senses give to the outer world. So what happens when we're thinking about our inner states? One of the things that we need to recognize is that our introspection, when we become aware of our beliefs, our desires, and our hopes and our fears and so forth, is all done through language and on the model of language. When I decide that I believe that John Donne gave a great talk this morning, when I believe that Hal Roth is a great scholar of Zen, and when I believe that Alan Wallace gave us a beautifully inspirational talk about the role of practice and contemplation in the understanding of the self, and I introspect that way, I'm using those sentences. Alan gave that great talk. John gave us a great talk about pramana and so forth as models for my inner states. And I'm not doing that because I looked inside and saw little English sentences in my brain. I'm doing that by using language as a kind of introspective model. That's a matter of self-interpretation. It's easy to forget that because it feels so immediate. So language gives us the concepts that we use to think about the world, but it is also the model for the concepts of our propositional attitudes, like belief, desire, knowledge, and so forth. And as a model, we have to recognize that the model, the map, isn't the reality, to go back to what John reminded us of earlier. Introspection in terms of language gives us an interpretation. It doesn't give us an independent reality that is being interpreted. And when we think about the Madhyamaka of Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, we remember that to be empty is to be empty of any intrinsic nature. And if we follow Chandrakirti, as I suggested earlier, that means that it is to exist only dependent on conceptual imputation. And what I am suggesting now is that all of our inner cognitive states that we introspect, we encounter only through a conceptual imputation, only through interpretation, only through language. And that is, they exist conventionally, not intrinsically, even though they might appear to us to exist just as we see them and to do so intrinsically. Now, this is not to say that our inner life has some kind of a second grade existence. Conventional reality is not second level reality. Because, as Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti also emphasized, we must remember that conventional reality, dependent origination, is exactly the same as emptiness, which is ultimate reality. The only kind of reality anything that we ever encounter is going to have is conventional reality. So when I'm talking here about cognitive illusion, I'm not arguing that the existence of our inner states is illusory. I'm arguing that the illusion is that we have immediate access to them as they are, and that their mode of existence is intrinsic existence. So this allows us to understand the Madhyamaka analysis of the most fundamental cognitive illusion of all, the illusion of the immediacy of our knowledge of our own minds and the givenness of our own inner states and processes. Our direct knowledge of them as the kinds of things they are, independent of any concepts. That's the illusion that Wittgenstein, Quine, and Sellers, each in their work so hard in the 20th century to diagnose and to cure. But we can put this just as easily and maybe more easily in the terms of 2nd century Indian Madhyamaka. The fundamental cognitive illusion is to take our mental states to exist intrinsically rather than conventionally, and to take our knowledge of them to be immediate, independent of conventions. This illusion is pervasive, it is instinctive, and it is profoundly self-alienating because it obscures the deeply conventional character of our own existence and of our self-knowledge. And this illusion is what, according to Buddhist philosophers, lies at the root of our grasping, of our attraction and aversion, and hence at the root of the pervasive suffering of existence. So much for Madhyamaka. I now want to shift schools and go to Yogacara. And here I might be disagreeing a little bit with Alan, who gave us a somewhat Madhyamika-inflected notion of what Yogacara looks like. I'm going to be a little bit more sympathetic. And here we have Asanga and Vasubandhu, the founders of the great Yogacara tradition. The Yogacara tradition offers us a somewhat different analysis of emptiness and of cognitive illusion. Not a contradictory analysis to that we've just seen, but an analysis from a different direction. It's a bit of a commonplace to think of Yogacara and Madhyamaka as rival positions regarding the nature of reality. But that's not the only plausible approach. And there's a great line of thought in Tibet that's gaining ascendancy now, fortunately, I think, in contemporary scholarship, according to which they simply represent distinct perspectives on emptiness and not a disagreement about what emptiness is. As the present Dalai Lama has said in a wonderful public talk, Madhyamaka approaches emptiness from the side of the object of knowledge, while Yogacara approaches emptiness from the side of the subject. I think that's a great way to see matters. And so I'm going to present Yogacara here as supplementing Madhyamaka rather than as conflicting with it. And I think that this approach makes good sense of the most important differences between Madhyamaka and Yogacara. It shows us how to reconcile the differences well. And the difference is this. While Madhyamaka takes emptiness to be the emptiness of intrinsic identity or intrinsic existence, Yogacara takes emptiness to be the emptiness of subject-object duality, or the absence of externality to the mind of the objects of mind. So I want to consider these formulations, and they're going to help us see how to join Madhyamaka and Yogacara. Yogacara theory, and I'm thinking here about three-nature theory and three-naturelessness theory, suggests to us that we are simply wired for certain illusions. And among them is the illusion of immediacy. And we're wired to thematize our experience through the framework of subject-object duality. I often compare this to the way that we're wired for certain optical illusions. For instance, you don't have to learn to see the Mueller-Lyer illusion as an illusion. We all see it as an illusion, and it's because of the way our visual system has evolved. And there are lots of other optical illusions like that, the color 5 phenomenon, for instance, and so forth. Yogacara really takes very seriously the idea that from beginningless time, we've evolved karmic predispositions to certain kinds of illusions, and these are some of them. And of course, a little bit of reflection shows that that duality has to be illusory. After all, we are not subjects, pure subjects, standing outside of the world of our experience, confronting a world of objects, some of them outer and some of them inner. That's the Vedanta position. That ain't the Buddhist position. Instead, what we are is organisms. And again, I will set aside all of the debates we might have about how those organisms are constituted. But we are organisms embedded in an environment, and our bodies, our sense faculties are part of the world in which we find ourselves. As a consequence, our subjectivity, our own engagement with the world, is constituted not by standing outside and detecting things, but rather by being embedded in the world. And the only way that we could possibly become aware of any object, whether it's a tree or an apple or a thought or a feeling, is to construct that as an object in our field of consciousness, even if in doing so, we manage to hide from ourselves the fact that we are constructing it. This is a second dimension of pervasive cognitive illusion. Madhyamaka analysis, as we saw a little bit earlier, reveals that objects we take to exist intrinsically are empty of intrinsic existence and instead exist only interdependently and conventionally. That's an illusion regarding the objects of knowledge, as well as, and it also shows us how to understand those objects correctly. Yogacara analysis, as we've just seen, reveals that the subjectivity that we take to be primordially dualistic in structure is empty of that subject-object duality and instead non-dual in nature. So this points to an illusion regarding the nature of the subject of knowledge and how to understand our subjectivity. And again, that's part of the root of suffering. So if we put together the Madhyamaka analysis of illusions regarding the objects of knowledge and Yogacara analyses regarding the illusions of subjectivity, we get a much more comprehensive understanding of where cognitive illusion fits into our experience. And now I really want to talk about how to put these together in detail, and that has to do with the synthesis that the great 9th century Indian philosopher Shantarakshita suggested. So there's Shantarakshita, and these are the two famous verses of the Ornament of the Middle Way that, show us where he does this synthesis. He says, on the basis of Yogacara, we should understand the non-existence of the external world. And on the basis of Madhyamaka, we should understand that the mind is empty. Those who ride the chariot of these two approaches, holding them together, and who hold the reins of reason will master the Mahayana and the meanings of the texts. And so let's talk a little bit about how that goes. When we look at the auto commentary on this, we get a really nice, analysis, as well as when we look at Gyaltsabche's commentary. The idea is not that somehow we want to understand Yogacara simply as Buddhism for dummies and Madhyamaka as smart Buddhism. Shantarakshita puts it as using Yogacara to understand conventional reality and Madhyamaka to understand ultimate reality. And there's a really nice way to think about that, because to understand conventional truth is not only to understand what its content is, to understand what is conventionally true, but also to understand where conventional truth comes from and why we take it so very seriously as truth. The Madhyamaka analysis of emptiness tells us exactly what emptiness is. It also tells us what conventional reality is, dependent origination. But Madhyamaka does not tell us how we come to experience conventional truth. And it doesn't explain why it is that we take it to be to be more than conventional, to exist intrinsically. Shantarakshita, though, sees that as the job of Yogacara. What Yogacara does through its detailed analysis of the nature of consciousness, through its detailed analysis of the three natures that all phenomena enjoy, and through its detailed analysis of the three respects in which things are natureless, gives us a nice analysis of how it is that we come to represent what is in fact dependently originated as independent and intrinsically real, and how it is that we come to see our mediated access to the world as immediate. And to do that, we need a very quick tour through the three natures and the three naturelessnesses, ideas that come to us from the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra, or the Sutra Unraveling the Thought. And here I'll be relying primarily on the analysis we find in the 7th chapter, the questions of Paramartha Samudgata. And I want to begin by talking about the imagined nature, which is the first of those three natures. It's really tempting when I look at a flower, like a rose, a nice red rose, to think that the color, the redness, is right on the rose. Unless you are extremely accomplished. When you look at a red rose, you see the color right out there in the rose, and you assume that your eyes are simply detecting color that is in the rose. Actually, that can't possibly be true. Color is something that emerges, as John pointed out this morning, through the interaction of our sense faculties and whatever is happening outside of them, and the color emerges in our minds. But we imagine things to exist outside of consciousness just as we perceive them. And that nature that we ascribe to the objects of our experience is their imagined nature. It's an imagined nature because we project it out there, even though on reflection, we each know that the redness can't possibly be painted out there in the rose. Footnote, it's equally stupid to think that when we detect the redness, we're detecting inner red paint that somehow is just detected by an inner eye. I assure you that when you look inside your brain, you will find no such inner red paint. To say that objects of experience are causally natureless, the second kind of naturelessness with respect to production, is to say they arise only through causal interactions, as we've been discussing. We don't encounter them in an immediate way. And the second nature, the dependent nature of things, is the fact that they don't exist independently of us, but rather all of the phenomena we ever experience, all of the objects in our world, are constructed through complex, and here I want to emphasize, opaque causal processes. None of us really understands exactly how our minds construct the world in which we live, even though we know that they construct them. And that means that the objects of our experience, because we are constructing them, are fundamentally non-dually related to us. They are not things we detect, they are constructions in which we participate. And then the third nature, the third naturelessness, is ultimate naturelessness. Because apart from the conditions of our subjectivity, we can't assign any nature to things. And I just want to give you a kind of example to give you a feel for this idea. We started with the rose, and I said, you know, we look at it and we just see that there's redness out there. But I want you to imagine two other sentient beings seeing that rose. And again, this reflects an analogy that John gave us earlier in the day. Imagine that there's a bee looking at that rose. Bees see colors in the infrared and the ultraviolet spectrum. They see all kinds of colors in that rose that we can't even see. It probably looks speckled and striped to them in all kinds of really cool ways. And they see it through compound eyes. My dog has got far less color sensitivity than we do, and he probably sees the rose in a shade of gray. Now, if we were to ask the question, which of the three of us, the bee, the dog, or me, sees the rose correctly, sees it as it is, we understand immediately that that's a stupid question. The only thing we can talk about is the rose as it shows up for a human being, the rose as it shows up for a bee, the rose as it shows up for a dog. But if you were to ask, oh, yeah, but what does the rose look like in itself? What does the rose itself look like? That is a really stupid question. And that's what ultimate naturelessness is. There is no way that things just are. There are only ways that things show up for different kinds of sensory and cognitive consciousness. And that is ultimate naturelessness. And that the awareness of that arises from this analysis of the conditions of our own subjectivity. The first two natures that is the imagined nature and the dependent nature, really give us a beautiful analysis of what conventional reality is and how we reify it. We take a bunch of interdependent processes that are perceptual, cognitive, and other, and we reify them as objects that exist just as they are, that we've simply detected. Conventional reality, then, the world that we live in, the world of roses, the world of violets, the world of wars, the world of sunshine, is the reality that is populated by things that we imagine to exist independently of our minds, by things that we imagine to have exactly the characteristics that we attribute to them. But it's a world that's in fact built and constituted by our minds, by our cognition, and all of the characteristics of the objects of our awareness are characteristics that they have only in virtue of the fact that our deceptive cognitive processes put them there. So the first two natures give us a beautiful analysis of conventional truth, and the third, ultimate naturelessness, gives us a beautiful analysis of ultimate truth. That is simply the fact that there is no way that things just are, apart from the ways they appear. And that's another nice way of saying that Yogacara gives us a very profound psychological explanation of how it is that we come to posit the conventional world and to posit it as more than simply conventional. So that's a little bit of Yogacara. And now I'm going to trespass on Hal's territory and talk a little bit about Zen to finish this Buddhist trajectory. I'm going to refer to here to Dogen. And one of the most, and when I look at Dogen, I'm going to be looking at two very particular fascicles. One is Gabyo, painted rice cakes, and the other is Genjo Koan, or actualizing the fundamental point. Two essays that I've found profoundly illuminating in my understanding of Buddha Dharma. And I take one of Dogen's really wonderful insights to be this, that even our own subjectivity is only present to us in illusory fashion. That it's not just that we are subject to illusion regarding the nature of our experiences because we only know them as they show up for us, but we are even subject to illusion regarding appearance. It's not just that we know our inner experience but don't know what outer world it corresponds to, but that even our inner experience is hidden from us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, beginning with this essay, Gabyo. Let's see, where are we? Okay. So this is Gabyo. I'm going to just read with you for a little bit. This is Kaz Tanahashi's translation, which I really like. Dogen says, the paints that we use for painting rice cakes are the same as those used for painting mountains and waters. For painting mountains and waters, blue and red paints are used. For painting rice cakes, rice flour is used. Thus, they're painted in the same way and examined in the same way. Accordingly, painted rice cakes spoken means that sesame rice cakes, herb rice cakes, milk rice cakes, toasted rice cakes, millet rice cakes, and the like are all actualized in the painting. Thus, you should understand that painting is all-inclusive. Rice cake is all-inclusive. Dharma is all-inclusive. In this way, all rice cakes actualized right now are nothing but a painted rice cake. If you look for some other kind of painted rice cake, you will never find it, and you will never grasp it. Dogen is using the rice cakes as a metaphor for the very illusion that I've been discussing, something that appears to exist in reality, but which is only a facsimile of that reality, a painting, not a real rice cake. In this opening passage, he rejects the seemingly obvious idea that although we apprehend only appearances, painted rice cakes, that there's something real that must stand behind them, real, non-painted rice cakes. Instead, he suggests it's painted rice cakes all the way down. Mountains and waters, the standard Zen metonym for the actual world of objects and processes, are as painted as well. Nothing in our experience can be described as something that we encounter as it is. Our very experiencing is just a way of painting. Now we go to this next passage. Dogen says, since this is so, there is no remedy for satisfying hunger other than a painted rice cake. Without painted hunger, you never become a true person. That's a beautiful line, by the way. There's no understanding of this painted satisfaction. In fact, satisfying hunger, satisfying no hunger, not satisfying hunger, not satisfying no hunger, cannot be attained or spoken of without painted rice cakes. For some time, study all of these as a painted rice cake. In this passage, Dogen turns that metaphor, which isn't so hard to accept when applied to the external world, since that's pretty standard Yogacara stuff of the kind we've been talking about before. But he turns the metaphor inward to come to the real point. Even when we consider our own cognitive states, they too are painted rice cakes. To the degree to which we are aware of them, we paint them. If we took anything to stand behind them, to the degree to which we become aware of that supposed reality, we would paint that as well. So the moral of this Buddhist illusionism that I'm seeing as tracking from Madhyamaka through Yogacara to Zen is not that we only encounter our experiences instead of encountering real objects. And I've heard that said before. The moral is really that we don't even encounter real experiences. We encounter illusions of experiences. We encounter experiences as they present themselves to us, as we construct them. And if we thought that our encounter with those illusions was even an encounter with actual illusions, we're wrong. We only see illusions of illusions, painted rice cakes. And that is, if we take this seriously, to come back to the point that I made at the very beginning of this discussion, we are not immediately aware of anything. There is no foundation for perception and no foundation for our conceptual scheme. So true self-knowledge on this understanding is not immediate awareness of our minds or their contents, looking in, even using the most skillful meditation techniques, and just seeing our minds and contents as they are. But true self-knowledge is an awareness of our own subjectivity, in a recognition that we can never have direct awareness of who we are. So true self-awareness has to be awareness of just how hidden we are from ourselves. Dogen in Genjo Koan writes, to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. When actualized by the myriad things, excuse me, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. When we examine our own being, that is, we discover that we have none. Just as there's no way that the rose is, only a way that it shows up. There's no way that we are, only how we show up for ourselves. All we experience are painted rice cakes. That doesn't deny our reality. That's not to say that we're not real beings. It's rather to affirm that our reality is interdependent and groundless, just like the reality of everything else. It's not a second-class reality compared to the reality of real rice cakes. Instead, we enjoy the only kind of reality there could ever be, the reality of paint. But lest we think that this insight itself, that we only encounter ourselves as we appear, that it is illusion all the way down, lest we think that that is realization, Dogen reminds us that even that is one more painted rice cake, one more illusion. So I now want to talk very, very quickly. I want to draw this together and think about liberation from immediacy. And we've been exploring a trajectory of thought regarding illusion in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, one that begins in ancient India and lands us in medieval Japan. The exploration, of course, is hardly exhaustive. We had a very short time, and I don't know very much. We've omitted dozens of philosophers, hundreds of texts, metaphors, and arguments on that textual road. I do hope, however, that this has given you some sense of how initial Buddhist reflections on the way that primal confusion grounds pervasive suffering, coupled with an analysis of reality in terms of the two truths and their paradoxical union, can lead us inexorably to a critique of the immediacy of experience. And from there, we get to the insight that illusion is not something from which we escape, but something woven into the very fabric of our experience. The most profound aspect of this understanding, I think, is that the fabric of our experience is woven from threads that are themselves illusory. It's not as though the illusion is the fabric and reality is the threads. Even the threads are illusory. And those threads are the conviction that we know ourselves, and the conviction that we can even know the illusory experiences that mediate our awareness, just as those experiences are. This all suggests a very deep aporia, a perplexity. True self-knowledge can only be the acceptance that there is no true self-knowledge. And even that fact, namely that true self-knowledge can only be the acceptance that there is none, is one more illusion. The great death, as the Zen tradition often characterizes awakening, is indeed a leap from a very, very high cliff. Fortunately for us, however, the abyss into which Buddha Dharma asks us to leap is bottomless. And for that reason, we need not fear a painful landing. Thank you very, very much.